Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Brian Fanion? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Brian Fanion was born in November 1963 and lived in Westfield, Massachusetts. This small town is 15 miles west of Springfield. Many members of Brian's family had been active in law enforcement and politics. His family name was well known and well respected in the community. In 1983, Brian met a teenager named Amy, and they became romantically involved. She had been born in June 1966, therefore she was about 2.5 years younger than Brian. The couple married in 1985 and went on to have 2 children, Travis and Victoria. That same year, Brian started working for the Westfield Police Department. Eventually, he became a detective. Brian was very active in his church. He was a deacon and a missionary. In June 2000, Brian and Amy paid $120,000 for a 3-bedroom, 1,800-square-foot farmhouse at 9 North Road. This farmhouse was built in the year 1800 and sat on 6 acres. In November 2017, when Brian went to Mexico for missionary work, he became friends with a woman named Corey Knowles. She lived near Brian and was on the same trip. A few months later, the relationship turned into an emotional affair. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On May 8, 2018, at 12:06 p.m., Brian Fanion called 911. He told the operator that his wife shot herself. When the police arrived, they found 51-year-old Amy Fanion dead from a single gunshot wound to the head. The bullet entered above and behind her right ear. The police recovered the weapon used to inflict the wound. It was a Smith & Wesson M&P 45 semi-automatic pistol chambered in .45 ACP. This firearm was Brian's service weapon, the one he carried every day for work, including that day. A spent .45 caliber case was found in the dining room. A deformed .45 caliber bullet was found in an enclosed porch adjacent to the dining room. The bullet had traveled through Amy's head, out of the dining room, and into that porch. Amy's brother Eric was in the backyard when the shooting took place. He went inside the farmhouse after hearing Brian call for help. Realizing that Brian was distraught due to Amy's death, Eric moved the pistol out of Brian's reach. Brian was interviewed by the police just a few hours after the shooting. Here's the story that he supplied. On May 7, 2018, the night before the shooting, Brian and his wife had been arguing about his upcoming retirement. He did not want to spend his retirement maintaining the farmhouse. Amy, on the other hand, loved the farmhouse and was upset by Brian's position. Furthermore, the couple had an old dog who was probably not going to live much longer. Amy wanted to get a new dog, but Brian wasn't interested because he wanted to travel. The next day, May 8, Brian went to work at the Westfield police station as usual. He left for his lunch break at 11:45 a.m. and made his way to the farmhouse. Amy, who had also been out that day, met him there. She prepared peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for lunch. The couple resumed the argument from the night before and ran into a new problem. Amy had committed them to go to a play involving a family member. The play was scheduled for the same day that Brian was planning on attending a disc golf tournament. This part of the story led me to a half-hour research tangent. Disc golf, which is also referred to as frisbee golf, is a sport similar to traditional golf, except it uses a frisbee. Instead of trying to hit a golf ball into a hole, participants try to throw a frisbee into a metal basket on a pole. Chains hanging above the basket increase the chances of the frisbee being knocked down into the basket. There are over 7,000 disc golf courses in the United States. Essentially, the sport delivers all the boredom of golf without having to buy expensive golf clubs. Moving back to the story, after Brian and his wife argued about the disc golf tournament, Brian needed to use the bathroom. Prior to entering the bathroom, he removed his service weapon and placed it on the hutch. This isn't out of the ordinary. Many people who carry guns remove them for restroom activity that involves the movement of their pants. Many holsters are connected to the pants in some way, so it's just easier to remove the weapon. Typically, people would carry their guns into the restroom before removing them, but Brian was in his own house, not at a public restroom. It wasn't like a stranger would have access to his gun. After exiting the bathroom, Brian discovered that his wife was holding his service pistol up to the right side of her head. She said something like, "It's obvious you don't want me around anymore." Brian tried to close the distance to stop her, about 4 to 5 feet, but she discharged the weapon before he made it. There was nothing he could do at that point. Amy was dead. When Brian was asked about any other lovers, he mentioned that he was friends with Corey, but he minimized the emotional affair part. He said there had been some flirting, but it was not sexual. The police interviewed Corey. She said that she and Brian first kissed on April 16, 2018. This was about 3 weeks before Amy was killed. On Brian's cell phone, the police found a substantial number of deleted text messages that made it seem like he and Corey were more than friends. Here are a few examples. On April 23, 2018, just a week after the first kiss, Corey texted, quote, "I can feel your lips on mine. Love that memory," unquote. Brian responded, quote, "I'm thinking of the one with your legs around my waist. Oh my," unquote. On May 4, 2018, 4 days before Amy's death, Brian wrote, quote, "What I wouldn't do for one of those big wrap-me-tight hugs," unquote. He followed this message by typing the letter M 6 times. Corey responded by typing 5 M's, then writing, quote, "To feel your hot breath on my skin," unquote. She wrote about how she loved being his angel and needed to hear his voice. Corey stated, "I love you." That same day, Brian complained that Amy was being attentive and clingy and thanked Corey for being the most amazing woman he had ever known. On May 7, 2018, the day before the shooting, Brian and Corey exchanged 72 text messages. For example, at 9:23 p.m., Brian wrote, quote, "Good night, my love. I hope you have wonderful dreams of amazing days and nights to come," unquote. He followed this message with 4 smiley faces. 10 minutes later, Corey responded with, quote, "Good night, my love. I will dream of you and all that the future holds for us," unquote. On May 8, 2018, the day of the shooting, Corey sent a message to Brian at 10:30 a.m., writing, "When can I hold you again?" She followed this with 5 question marks. 2 minutes later, Brian responded, "Not soon enough," turning into a very long warning. At 12:47 p.m., the tone of the communication changed significantly. Brian wrote, quote, "Please don't call or text for a while. I'll call you when I can. Really bad. Pray for my family, please," unquote. Based on the emotional affair, the trajectory of the bullet that killed Amy, and other evidence, Brian was indicted on a charge of first-degree murder in November of 2019. This was about a year and a half after Amy's death. Officers paid a visit to Brian at the farmhouse and placed him under arrest. When the police told him he was under arrest, he was eating assorted nuts. One officer said that Brian was so stunned to hear about the arrest, his nuts dropped to the floor. It sounds like Brian had more problems that day than just being arrested. He may want to get that checked out. Brian was released on February 14, 2020, after posting $200,000 cash bail. The police did not offer any update on the assorted nuts. I imagine they wanted to target more difficult goals with their investigative efforts, not just focus on low-hanging fruit. On February 21, 2023, Brian's trial started. On March 22 of that year, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. That same day, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In January of 2024, one of Brian's relatives sold the farmhouse on his behalf for $365,000. I guess Brian figured he didn't need the farmhouse anymore, mostly because of the murder part. Now moving to my analysis. Brian Fanion maintains his innocence and has a tremendous number of supporters, including almost every member of Amy's family. The defense argued that Amy was the one who pulled the trigger. She was an impulsive and angry individual. The state, of course, disagreed. They argued that when looking at all the evidence, it's clear that Brian murdered his wife. They thought the evidence was overwhelming. This brings me to the question, was Brian Fanion guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Brian had a motive to kill in the form of an emotional affair with Corey. He initially minimized the seriousness of this relationship when speaking to the police. Brian had a financial incentive to commit murder. He had been looking into what effect a divorce would have on his pension. Corey said that Brian told her he could not sustain his lifestyle in retirement if he divorced. After the affair started, Brian made several curious searches on his computer at work. For example, he appeared to be interested in common and dangerous poisons, drugs that caused the most deaths each year, common household items that can kill, carbon monoxide, common prescription drugs that lead to overdose, common sources of radiation, apartments for rent in the area, and whether emotional infidelity was worse than a sexual affair. Even though Brian was not actively working on any investigation involving gunshot residue, he searched this term 11 days before the shooting and watched a video about it. On the day of the shooting, right before his wife died, Brian searched Massachusetts Medical Examiner offices. The bullet that killed Amy entered above and behind her right ear and followed a downward angle. This is unusual in cases of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. No gunshot residue was found on her head. An expert testified that this meant the gun was fired from at least 18 inches away. The weapon that killed Amy was Brian's service pistol. It seems incredibly convenient that he just happened to remove the weapon during an argument and leave it unattended. The day before the murder, Amy did not appear to be upset when communicating with other people. Moving to the exculpatory factors, according to some of Amy's family members, she had impulse control and anger problems. She would snap at Brian and treat him like a child. Amy had a history of depression, but stopped taking medication to treat it and instead relied on herbal remedies. 6 days before she died, Amy made an entry in her diary suggesting that she was coping with serious issues. Brian was not upset when Corey broke up with him after the shooting. Why would he kill to be with somebody he didn't care about? As far as the internet searches about drugs, carbon monoxide, poisons, and radiation, Brian and Amy were preparing to have a child stay at the farmhouse, so Brian may have been researching hazards in order to keep the child safe. An expert for the defense testified that Amy's hair could have functioned as a filter and prevented the gunshot residue from reaching the wound. The police never tested Amy's hair. The pistol could have been fired at point-blank range, which is consistent with Brian's story. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I think that Brian Fanion was guilty of murder? In my opinion, he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but the evidence was not overwhelming. I was barely convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Brian had a strained relationship with his wife and did not want to spend his retirement with her. When he started having an affair, he devalued his wife even more. His communication with his affair partner, Corey, was immature, clumsy, awkward, and starry-eyed. Brian became lost in a fantasy. He dreamed of a world featuring an excessive quantity of M's and question marks. On the day of the shooting, Brian impulsively killed his wife during an argument. He may have been planning to kill her eventually, using some other method like poison, but on that day, he simply lost control and shot her with his own service weapon. Brian managed to mount a pretty good defense, considering how obvious his crime was. It's not all bad news for Brian. He has a good chance of being the star player on the prison disc golf team. Those are my thoughts on the case of Brian Fanion. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They consistently generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching. One officer said that Brian was so stunned to hear about the arrest, his nuts dropped to the floor. One officer said that Brian was so stunned to hear about the arrest, his nuts dropped to the floor. One officer said that Brian was so stunned to hear about the arrest, his nuts dropped to the floor. One officer said that Brian was so stunned to hear about the arrest, his nuts dropped to the floor. One officer said that Brian was so stunned to hear about the arrest, his nuts dropped to the floor. It sounds like Brian had more problems that day than just being arrested. You may want to get that checked out.